If you ask somebody if they've ever played Prey, most people might reply, "What? You mean that 2017 sci-fi game that nobody heard about because it was barely marketed?" No, why'd you ask? But what almost no one knows is that Prey wasn't born in 2017. There was a game before it, a groundbreaking FPS built by a team who poured everything into it, only to have their creation taken away the moment it was done. I'm talking of course about Prey, developed by Human Head Studios. In 2006, this strange and visionary shooter appeared seemingly out of nowhere. A game that had portals long before, well, Portal, rooms that rotated around you and living alien technology in the palm of your hand. It was a game that haunted the industry for more than a decade, a game that journalists labelled vaporware, a game that died, came back to life, died again, and then somehow returned stronger than ever. This is the unbelievable story of Prey, the shooter that refused to stay dead. But before we jump into all that, what was Prey? Picture this, you're at a bar where your girlfriend works and she's closing up for the night when suddenly the fucking roof blows off and the entire building gets abducted into space. This all happens in the first 5 minutes, by the way. Next thing you know, you're thrown onto this living alien ship where the walls pulse, the enemies hunt you, and all of humanity is on the menu. Prey is the story of Tommy, a Cherokee man who never really believed in destiny, until he's forced to fight through this biomechanical nightmare to save the woman he loves and discover the power of the spirit world that's within him.
Listen, Tommy. You cannot turn your back on your heritage any longer. It will give you strength.
Strength? For what?
To save yourself. To survive.
Survive? What are you talking about?
Prey began as early as 1995 and was originally conceived by 3D Realms, you know, the team behind those small games like Duke Nukem and the Wolfenstein series. The game went through many different forms during the first development period, which wasn't unusual at the time. Tim Hall, previously of id Software, outlined some of the earliest designs for the game, but after about a year's work, he left the project and the company to form Ion Storm with ex-id founder John Romero. After this, 3D Realms brought on somebody else, Paul Sciutima, to begin the next phase in Prey's development and create a whole new game design. The alien abduction theme from Hall's work would stay, but now the game would take place on a massive ring-shaped world called Trakara, inhabited by 4 different alien races. The player would take the role of a Native American hero called Talon the Brave. And it was at this stage of development that the game began to take shape and, in all honesty, got quite exciting. The project was extremely experimental for the era. 3D Realms had big ideas they wanted to implement, like the portal technology. Portals were a feature that allowed rips in space to be created and moved and reshaped in real time. This might not sound like much now, but remember, this was 30 years ago. This is long before gravity guns from Half-Life or the portal systems from Portal, and the portals were going to be a core feature of the gameplay. 3D Realms demonstrated some of these features at the 1997 and 98 E3 exhibitions to a lot of excitement. The public perception was super positive. I mean, the game looked good and 3D Realms were a name to take notice of, especially fresh from the success of Duke Nukem 3D. But ultimately, this incarnation of Prey would run out of steam as well. Technical problems made development crash. All of 3D Realms' ideas really were groundbreaking on paper, but by the late 1990s, the technology to pull it off just simply wasn't stable enough. The portal of ideas was open, sure, but developers couldn't quite see through to the other side. Head engineer William Scarborough would comment that, in hindsight, portal tricks such as these should be used as tricks, not as an engine paradigm. Test builds were made and they even had a very rough playable version of the game, but it would be much different to the finished product that wouldn't be playable for nearly 10 years. Frustrated and exhausted, the developers put the title on indefinite hold. And for most studios, this is where the story would end. You can almost picture it. Prey drifting away into a sea of countless other ambitious 90s shooters, simply another cautionary tale, but Prey wouldn't stay dead for very long. 3D Realms realised that if they couldn't make the game, well, maybe another studio could. Maybe, just maybe, there was a studio out there that could change Prey's legacy. And that studio was Human Head. Now, Human Head Studios wasn't some massive industry giant. They weren't sitting on blockbuster budgets or complicated game engines. What they did have, though, was experience. Founded by former developers from id Software and Raven, these were people who understood shooters at a fundamental level, and more importantly, they understood limits. When Human Head Studios took one look at Prey, they realised they needed to strip things back a bit. Not take away the fundamentals, but make it so that the game could actually be made. Because if the game was ever going to ship, it needed to be rebuilt, not continued in its current state. What mattered with Prey wasn't the ambition or the scope of what the previous developers tried to do, it was the idea. So Human Head stripped Prey down to its bare bones and asked that question: what has to survive? A first-person shooter that didn't obey reality. A game where walls weren't walls and gravity wasn't constant and death itself worked differently. A shooter that felt alien. And this is where Prey started to become the Prey that we know today. The protagonist was reimagined as Tommy, a Cherokee man disconnected from his heritage who gets thrust into this alien nightmare that forces him to confront his identity, belief, and destiny. The Native American themes weren't just a flavour anymore, they started to become central to the game's mechanics and story. The spirit walking, resurrection after death, and Tommy's soul leaving his body weren't just cutscene ideas now, they were systems. All of this again sounded great on paper, but there was still one massive problem: the technology to pull this off. Human Head knew that they couldn't repeat the mistakes of the 90s. They couldn't chase impossible engines or gamble on unstable tech. So instead of building something new, they made something of a controversial choice. They moved Prey onto a heavily modified version of the Doom 3 engine. Now, at the time, this raised a few eyebrows because Doom 3 was known for its tight corridors, the heavy lighting, and more horror-focused design, not reality-bending sci-fi puzzles. But Human Head knew this engine. It was stable, flexible, and could be easily modified. With the Doom 3 engine, now the portals were finally real. Actual windows through space, rendered in real time, that you could shoot and walk through, and see yourself from the other side. And this is what makes what Human Head Studios did even more impressive. They didn't innovate by inventing brand new technology. They innovated by using existing technology in ways that no one else really tried to. But despite all this progress, the outside world still didn't know Prey had a pulse, or didn't believe it at least. Years had now passed, and screenshots had disappeared, online forums went quiet, and trailers stopped coming. To the public, Prey was still just vaporware, a punchline, the game that would never come out. But behind closed doors, Human Head kept working, quietly rebuilding a game that the industry had already given up on. In July 2006, after more than a decade of false starts and cancellations, engine switches, and industry doubt, Prey finally released. There was no relaunch campaign, no redemption narrative, no "this game survived development hell" victory lap, it just arrived. And the weird thing is, it felt immediately out of place. You've got to remember that in 2006, first-person shooters looked a certain way. They were much more grounded and militaristic, very beige and serious. They were about squads, scripts, and tightly orchestrated spectacle. Games like Call of Duty 2 and 3 would dominate in the conversation. Tightly scripted World War II campaigns built around explosive set pieces and controlled pacing. Games like Battlefield 2 were all about realism, pushing modern military combat, authentic weapons, and team-based play as the future of the genre. Tactical shooters like Rainbow Six Vegas leaned hard into the grounded realism as well, with squad commands, cover systems, the urban warfare, presenting shooters as serious, methodical experiences. And even more horror-leaning games like Fear wrapped their supernatural elements in sterile offices, military hardware, and muted colour palettes. This was the language of shooters in 2006. Real guns, real soldiers, and real conflicts. So when Prey showed up with rotating rooms and spirit worlds with alien walls that could breathe, well, it was a little bit jarring. Prey opened up with a bar getting ripped into the sky by an alien ship whilst Blue Oyster Cult blasted in the background. I mean, that alone should have been a warning. From the very first hour, Prey made it clear it wasn't interested in following the rules. Critics and industry folk acknowledged the tech. They had to, because there was nothing else like it on the market. But this is where things got a little bit difficult. because Prey didn't quite fit the language that reviewers were used to using. The game was too linear to be called a sandbox game. Prey was too inventive to be dismissed, but too strange to be fully embraced. Prey was complicated. Some reviewers praised it as being bold and imaginative, and clearly impressed by how willing it was to break the rules. But others dismissed it as too short, as if every idea-driven shooter was contractually obliged to last 40 hours. Some players loved the mechanics but felt that the gunplay itself was fairly conventional, whilst a lot of people simply didn't know what to do with the tone of the game, which somehow managed to be spiritual and violent and science fiction, deeply personal and occasionally uncomfortable all at the same time. In other words, it just simply didn't fit neatly into a review template. And Prey wasn't misunderstood because it was bad, but simply because it didn't look or feel like anything else at the time. It didn't chase multiplayer trends or position itself as the next big competitive shooter. It didn't introduce a mascot character clearly designed for sequels or merch, and it didn't stretch itself into a bloated 40-hour epic just to justify its price. Prey told the story it wanted to tell. It showed off its ideas and it didn't overstay its welcome. Ironic, considering it took 10 years to make. Prey launched in a year packed with louder, safer, more marketable games that met expectations, that explained themselves clearly, and played exactly the way shooters were expected to play in 2006. But Prey asked players to unlearn some of that, and in 2006 most people simply weren't in the mood to relearn the genre. The sales of the game were modest, and the praise was cautious. Despite the passion and creativity behind it, the game just never exploded in the way its ideas probably deserved. But time has a way of changing perspective, because in the years that followed, shooters began borrowing ideas that Prey had already figured out, like the reality-bending spaces and mechanical approaches to death and environmental puzzles. All of a sudden, Prey didn't feel that strange anymore. For a brief period after release, it genuinely seemed like Prey might finally be safe. No, the game didn't set the world on fire, but it sold well enough and it built a loyal audience and, most importantly, proved that its ideas worked. Human Head Studios began development on a sequel almost immediately, and that sequel would have been Prey 2. But somehow, despite everything that had already happened, this was the point where things got even messier. Prey 2, like its predecessor, wasn't interested in playing it safe. Instead of continuing Tommy's story, it threw that entire premise out of the window. Players would take control of a human bounty hunter stuck in an alien city, a massive open-ended sci-fi metropolis filled with vertical exploration, futuristic weapons, and player-driven objectives. It looked less like a traditional shooter and more like Blade Runner. It was stylish and confident and was clearly trying to do something different, which, historically speaking, was not a great sign for the Prey franchise. Early footage was shown and again the reaction was strong. Prey 2 wasn't being talked about because it was vaporware or had troubled production again, but because it looked genuinely exciting. But history has a way of repeating itself. Slowly things started to quiet down again, and behind the scenes, development was struggling. Disagreements started to form between Human Head and their new publisher Bethesda. Milestones and development started getting missed and the communication just broke down. The project was lingering in an uncomfortable limbo where no one publicly admitted it was dead, but no one seemed to be actively saving it either. And eventually, Bethesda pulled the plug. Prey 2 was cancelled.
I think you can see why we're really excited about Prey.
I think so.
And I hope the people who watch this show are just gonna be droolers to this game.
I'm already drooling, so what can I say?
Cool, well thanks so much for visiting us.
Much, Paul.
Human Head Studios never released another Prey game. Not long after that, the studio itself shut down. After more than a decade of work across multiple generations of hardware, the original creators were simply gone. And to make matters worse, they didn't even get to take the name with them, because Prey wasn't theirs. The IP now belonged to Bethesda, their new publisher, which meant that the title was now completely detached from the team that made it matter in the first place. And for several years, that was it. Prey returned to being a ghost story, a game that people brought up in conversations about cancelled sequels, wasted potential, and franchises that never quite caught a break. That was until 2017. That's when Bethesda revived the game Prey again, this time to be developed by Arcane Studios. But as you may know, this new Prey was not a sequel or even a continuation. It wasn't even remotely connected to the original game. Instead, Prey, released in 2017, was an immersive sim set on a space station, more focused on player choice and environmental storytelling. It was thoughtful and complex and very clearly an arcane game, but it was also called Prey for reasons that still confuse everyone involved to this day. Fans of the original game didn't recognise it. New players had no idea there even was an earlier Prey, and players were left wondering if they needed to play the first game before jumping into the newest entry. Even Arkane's developers admitted that the name wasn't really their decision. It was insisted on by Bethesda. Once again, the name worked against the game attached to it, because the 2017 Prey was impressive in many ways, but its branding felt like a bit of a stain, and meant that both games could never really be differentiated from each other. Neither Prey, released in 2006, or Prey, released in 2017, really got a chance to let their personalities shine, and somehow both versions of the game ended up underappreciated for similar reasons. Looking back now, the original Prey didn't fail because it lacked ideas. If anything, it had too many. Its Portals predated Portal. Years later, Portal would build entire experiences around impossible geometry, whilst games like Titanfall 2 would push movement and wall running and spatial manipulation into the mainstream. Its treatment of death as a mechanic rather than a punishment would also become increasingly common. Instead of stopping the player and forcing a reload, death in Prey fed directly back into the game. This idea would later be explored in games like BioShock, which removed traditional game over screens, and much later in games like Hades, where dying adds to the narrative progression. Its willingness to blend narrative and culture and mechanics foreshadowed where the medium was heading. Prey didn't just tell a story about identity and spirituality, it embedded those themes directly into how the game was played. Prey wasn't predicting any single game. You could say it was anticipating a shift towards shooters and action games that trusted players to understand ideas through interaction and not just exposition. But in 2006, that was still a few years too early. Prey wasn't trying to follow trends, it just somehow ended up running ahead of them. And that's why Prey still lingers in conversations today. That's the afterlife of Prey. A game that died and came back, somehow died again, but still managed to leave a mark.